Welcome back to episode 3 from chapter 12. We're still looking at monopolistic competition, but now we're turning our attention to the long run. So this part is similar to perfect competition. We saw there that an important condition was that there is free entry and exit, so old firms can leave costlessly. Also, new firms can enter costlessly. That's going to drive economic profits to zero. Same story as before in per competition. So here's the intuition. Suppose that profits are positive, and profits can be positive in the short run. We saw an example earlier. So we saw back here, this firm was making a profit, and that's possible in the short run. Also, profits can be negative in the short run. We saw an example back over here where the firm is making negative $40. So in the short run, economic profits can be non-zero. In the long run, though, that changes. Where were we? We're back here. So if profits are positive, then that's going to lure new firms to join this market. So we said that restaurants, for example, are an example of monopolistic competition. So if you see a lot of restaurants out there making big profits and you think you could do just as well because you know something about cooking, then you're going to enter that market, create your own restaurant, and that's going to create extra competition, which will decrease profits for everybody else. That's going to keep happening as long as profits are still positive. New firms will keep joining, and that's going to reduce profits more and more and more until they vanish entirely. The reason also works in reverse. Suppose that economic profits are negative in the short run, like our firm earlier that was making a loss. Firms can sustain a negative profit temporarily, but they can't keep going with that forever and ever. At some point, they're going to go out of business. Some might just actually go bankrupt, or they might decide to leave the market before while they're still alive and try to trim their losses and try to luck somewhere else. That's also possible. So, in any case, established firms will leave when economic profits are negative. So, that's going to reduce the amount of competition, which will make the profits go up, and that's going to continue until they go back to zero. So while the reason is the same as it was before under per competition, the graphs you're going to see here are going to look a bit different because it's a different situation, different market structure. There's still going to be a markup price greater than marginal cost, even in the long run, even when there are zero profits, when there are monopolistically competitive firms. So here's what our graph looks like. So here we have in blue our average total cost curve. This orange line is the marginal cost curve. Demand is in green, and MR marginal revenue is in red. So same result before, same intercept as demand, but double the slope. So first you find the profit maximizing quantity, looking where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost. That's true both the short run and the long run. To find the price, you got to plot that on a demand curve over here and then go over to the y-axis. So price should be around 60 or so. Now, to have zero profits, you have to have your ATC curve, your average total cost, equal to the price. If that's true, then the price per unit, that is the revenue per unit, equals cost per unit. So that's going to exactly offset and you get zero profits. So that's why P equals ATC is a zero profits condition. Now there's an extra condition as well that also applies here. The ATC curve, average total cost, has to be tangent to demand. It's got the same slope, so it's going to touch the demand curve once and only once. So here's why that is true. Let's imagine for a moment that ATC, average total costs, were not tangent to demand. You could have some situation like this, for example. Well, if it's not tangent, it's going to cross over demand more than once. What's that going to imply? is that you're going to have this region over here where the firm can make positive profits. So these 2 points, price equals average total cost, you have a 0 profits, but that would be violating profit maximization. To fix some other point over here, like quantity being 10, at that point, your price would be above your costs. So this rectangle over here would correspond to profit. So price is your revenue per unit, making this much money per unit, all the way up here. But your cost per unit somewhere down here, that's smaller. So this gap, this distance is profit per unit multiplied by 10 units. So while firms could produce over here and here and make 0 profits, they're not going to do it because firms want to maximize their profits. So this can't work. That's why you have to have ATC be tangent like this, so you're both profit maximizing and 0 profits at the same time. Sometimes 0 profits really is the best you can do. So that's the long run. Now let's look at the analysis of social welfare. So our main tool here is looking at total surplus. That is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So first we'll contrast the graphs we had earlier. We just established that for the long run with monopolistic competition, you have price equal to ATC, and also ATC, average total costs, are tangent to demand. So it looks like this. Now, monopolistic competition looks different. Perfect competition looks different. So we said back in chapter 9, with perfect competition, you have this going on. So you have price equal marginal cost, the perfect competition condition for maxing profit, and you also have 0 profits in the long run. So it's going to imply it's going to produce over here. So we have this name for this particular point. We call that point the efficient scale. You're producing where average total costs are minimized. Now, it's not a coincidence that that point also corresponds to where the marginal cost curve intersects ATC. We did not prove it, the proof is in intermediate micro, but it can be shown that ATC is minimized where MC equals ATC. So that'd be this point right over here. So that same notion of an efficient scale exists for a monopolistically competitive firm. That'd be the point right out here. So again, where ATC is minimized is where ATC equals MC. That's going to be right over here. So that's your efficient scale. However, we just showed that to maximize profit, the monopolistically competitive firm is going to produce a quantity that's going to be back here where MR equals MC. So our big result is that monopolistically competitive firms produce a lower quantity than perfect competition does. So that gap between the quantity the monopolistically competitive firm produces and what the efficient scale is, we call that excess capacity. So the firm could be producing more and be efficient for them to produce more, but they don't do so because they're trying to maximize profit, and that brings them to produce a lower quantity. So what we said earlier, we had some intuition for why prices are lower in perfect competition than for other kinds of market structures. With perfect competition, your firm is too small to have any influence over the market price. So if you produce more, you don't worry about that driving down prices. If you're in a different kind of market structure, like a monopoly, or more mildly under monopolistic competition, then if you produce more, you have to lower prices in order to sell those extra units. That's going to make you somewhat reluctant to increase your production. So these kinds of firms have reluctance to produce more that perfect competition does not cause, so they're going to produce a smaller quantity. Now, what does that mean for welfare? We showed earlier that perfect competition is going to maximize social welfare. If you produce a quantity that's going to be smaller than perfect competition, then welfare is not going to be maximized, so that's not going to be the best possible case for society. So there's going to be some welfare loss with monopolistic competition. Now, that being said, the welfare loss can be pretty small. Unlike a monopoly, there are lots of close substitutes for monopolistic competition. So monopolists can jack their price up a lot and create these big welfare losses. Under monopolistic competition, like a restaurant, you can't raise prices by a whole lot. Your ability to influence prices is much more modest, so therefore the welfare loss will also be much more modest. So it's not perfect, but welfare loss will be pretty mild compared to other market structures. So here's our graph. So in the corner here, we're showing the case for perfect competition. Remember, consumer surplus is the gap between demand, what you're willing to pay, and then what you actually had to pay. So if you thought the good was worth $11, but you only paid $5, then overall you're $6 better off. And that distance represents you, the consumer's welfare. There is the analogous concept for the producer. If your marginal cost was 2, but you sold the good for 5, then that extra production boosted profits by 5 minus 2, which is $3. So that's producer surplus. If you're out over here, the perfect competition outcome, that's going to maximize total surplus. This whole area here is benefiting consumers and firms. Now, monopolistic competition is going to be different. So here, we look at where is marginal revenue equal marginal cost. Here's demand in blue. MR, as always, has the same intercept, but double the slope. That crosses over MC at this point. So, for perfect competition, you have price equals marginal cost. That would be a point out here. Monopolistic competition means you produce a quantity, it's going to be back there, so a smaller quantity. And you find the price by applying that quantity on a demand curve. So that'd be a price up here. So what that means for welfare, go down to our next graph down here. So the price is higher than it'd be under perfect competition. Perfect competition price would be down here. That increase in price is going to squeeze consumer surplus. So instead of getting this big triangle over here, as you would under perfect competition, now you get this smaller triangle, this smaller purple triangle under monopolistic competition. Now, producer surplus has expanded. I can say that unambiguously, even though price and quantity have changed in different directions. So price has risen compared to perfect competition. Compare these two graphs. You have a higher price. Quantity has decreased. However, the firm decreased that quantity because it knew that decreasing quantity would increase its profits and therefore increase producer surplus. Now, to be clear, producer surplus and profit are not quite the same thing. More precisely, profit is producer surplus minus fixed costs. However, in order to increase its profit, it has to increase its producer surplus, so this area has increased. So firms benefit at the expense of consumers, but that transfer of welfare is not entirely one-to-one. There's also that red region over here, this red triangle, which is now no longer part of anybody's welfare. So under perfect competition, for those last few transactions, consumers got a little bit of a benefit from those, and the firms also got a little bit of a benefit. Not a whole lot, but it was a benefit. So Peel benefited from all that happening, because if you have less than perfect competition, firms are trying to raise prices and restrict quantity. Now those transactions no longer happen, so neither consumers nor producers benefit from those last few transactions. That's the welfare loss, the deadweight loss that occurs if you have less than perfect competition if you have monopolistic competition. So like I was saying before, while there are welfare losses because demand is so elastic, the firm's ability to raise prices is very much constrained, and the welfare loss will be quite mild. As a result, if you try to put some policy solutions in place like we had for monopolies, it's probably going to be more trouble than it's worth. With monopolies, there are a lack of close substitutes. There's pretty much just one seller that you're pretty much had to buy from, so their ability to raise price and constrain quantity and create welfare losses was much, much bigger, and policy solutions were typically a very good idea for trying to deal with monopolies. So, to illustrate that point, we'll go back to the four solutions we had earlier for dealing with monopolies and see how they're mostly not quite so applicable to monopolistic competition. So one thing you could do to a monopoly is break it up into smaller firms. That creates more competition. Now if you have monopolistic competition, you already have a lot of small firms. There already are lots of restaurants out there. So you try to break them up into smaller restaurants, then it's probably not going to do a whole lot. So you can see that this solution doesn't really apply quite so well to monopolistic competition. Another proposed solution to monopolies is to reduce trade barriers. For instance, a monopoly in the US might not be a monopoly worldwide. So now the market becomes competitive again, and that's good for consumers and also good for social welfare. Now, this one really is a good idea. It's hard to find economists against trade, so lower trade barriers also helps with the markets when you have monopolistic competition. So that one does apply. That's a good idea. Like I said before, economists are very, very, very pro-trade. So this solution will apply to both monopolies and to monopolistic competition. Now we said also that regulation can be helpful when you have a monopoly. We had this idea really that actually a binding price ceiling could, surprisingly enough, increase welfare. That inverted our result we had back in chapter 5. Chapter 6. So here's our graph. Demand is shown here in blue, and marginal revenue is in orange down here. So as always, same intercept, double the slope. You find where is marginal revenue equal marginal cost, and that tells you the quantity you want to produce. Plot that quantity on the demand curve. That'll be up here. So the firm's going to charge a price that's going to be this high. So an intelligently designed price ceiling is going to be over here. That's where price equals marginal cost, because that is the perfect competition outcome. And we already know perfect competition is efficient, typically. That's given by our friend, the first fundamental welfare theorem. So the right price ceiling can restore efficiency. Now, we do have a caveat to be aware of. We said that with monopolies, you do have to be aware of what is the demand curve, what is the marginal cost curve, and what is the marginal revenue curve in order to set the proper price ceiling. If you don't know what those variables are, and typically you don't, then this could go very badly awry. Now in the case of monopolies, even if you misjudge it, the welfare loss of monopoly is so large that even a somewhat imperfect price ceiling can still improve welfare. With monopolistic competition, though, the welfare losses are pretty small, so if you misjudge where to set your price ceiling, that could actually make things worse. So trying to correct this could be more trouble than it's worth if these variables are unknown. Now trying to estimate these variables can be quite tricky. The firm knows that you're going to set the price ceiling based on the marginal cost, so you just give them a survey, ask them, what's your marginal cost? They're probably going to lie to you. They're probably set the marginal cost in such a way that's going to try and induce you to set a high price ceiling. They're probably going to exaggerate what their costs are. So they're probably going to say, our marginal costs are way up here. They set a really high price ceiling that's going to end up being non-binding. So just asking them a survey, not going to work. You could try surveying consumers about what's your demand schedule look like, so you can find what demand is. Consumers, though, are going to know because the price ceiling based on this, so they also have an incentive to lie. They say their demand is going to be somewhere to set a really low price ceiling or try to get you to do that. So if surveys are not going to work, it's just going to be hard to know what's the proper price ceiling. If the welfare loss is pretty small, it's probably not worth getting involved in a lot of trouble in the first place. Also, lots of different firms that are not quite selling the same thing. You have a different price ceiling for each restaurant, and that's going to involve estimating a lot of different demand curves and a lot of different MC curves, and that's going to be imperfect in the estimation. So, still a good idea for monopoly because the welfare losses are so big for monopolies that even if you don't get as perfect, you'll still improve things. But for monopoly competition, not a good idea probably, unless you have this perfect knowledge of where you should set the price ceiling. The last solution we had that was not in the book but is a valid approach to dealing with monopolies is a subsidy. We showed earlier that typically in a perfectly competitive market, a subsidy creates inefficiency. So what happens here is this red deadweight loss triangle. So demand curve tells you what consumers are willing to pay. The supply curve we know is the marginal cost curve under perfect competition. If you have a subsidy for demand, consumers start buying more in order to collect that subsidy. What happens if they're buying goods that they don't value very much? They're doing this mostly to get the subsidy and not so much because they think the good is very valuable. So consumers think the good is not very important, but the marginal costs of making it are high. Overall, it's going to be a loss to society, and that's going to lower surplus, lower social welfare. So what subsidies do is they cause firms to produce more. In this example, that means the extra person is going to be inefficient. However, with monopolistic competition, it's a different story. The firm is producing too little. So policy gets the firm to produce more might be just what the doctor ordered. That could be restoring efficiency. Here's how that could work. So our blue line here is demand, and MR is here in orange. You first find where is marginal revenue equal marginal cost. That'd be right over here. So the firm want to make about 6 units, and they charge a price about this high. So that's what happens with no government intervention. They want to compare that to what's the efficient outcome. Efficiency is perfect competition. Price equals marginal cost. So the firm should be doing to be efficient for society would be to produce over here to make this quantity and charge that price. So the right kind of subsidy is going to shift the marginal cost curve. So the old marginal cost curve was over here. With the properly designed subsidy, now marginal costs are going to fall and be over here. This is the marginal cost curve net of subsidy. So now when the firm sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, they're going to pick this quantity. Because we designed our subsidy perfectly, that's going to correspond to exactly that efficient outcome. So the right subsidy does restore efficiency. That can work for monopolies. We said it could be a good idea for dealing with monopolies. Now for monopolistic competition, probably not such a good idea. That's because, again, with monopolistic competition, the welfare loss is pretty small, and also estimating MR, MC, and demand is going to be very imperfect. If you misjudge where these curves are, you get the wrong subsidy, and the wrong subsidy might make things worse instead of better. So probably not worth getting involved if it's monopolistic competition. Still a good idea though if it's a monopoly, because monopolies really do have some serious issues for society. So that wraps up our section on social welfare in the long run for monopolistic competition. Come back for our very last episode and we'll look at advertising.